And now we're live. Jan, du kannst jetzt beginnen.
Danke, Ursula. Ja, guten Abend von der Deutsch-Israelischen Gesellschaft, Arbeitsgemeinschaft Bonn. Mein Name ist Jan Eikenbohm. Zugeschaltet ist meine Vorstandskollegin Ursula Schmidt und unser Gast Dan Schiftan. Es ist die dritte von 4 Videokonferenzen mit dir, Dan. Dein heutiger Vortrag behandelt den Umgang mit der Pandemie in Israel und ihre wirtschaftlichen Folgen. Das Thema betrifft uns auch in Deutschland sehr. Wir freuen uns darauf, von dir die israelische Perspektive und die israelischen Erfahrungen kennenzulernen. Wie in unseren vorherigen Konferenzen auch, können unsere Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer Fragen an Dan über die Kommentarfunktion in YouTube stellen. Wir werden die dann weiterleiten. Dan wird Englisch sprechen, aber die Fragen können sowohl in Englisch als auch in Deutsch gestellt werden. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I want to discuss today actually 3 subjects: the corona and the Israeli way we've dealt with it, not very successfully. I'll come to it in a moment. The very major economic crisis that Israel is in now and the dangers in Israel about this economic crisis. And finally, because Europe is our largest trading partner, and because the possibility of the Israeli economy being affected very considerably by what the Europeans may do under certain circumstances, I think it is important to understand, A, because it affects the economy, B, because I'm speaking to Europeans and this is a subject that may come up. I want to bring in the European issue on the economic question, but to go beyond it and to explain what the problem is. But let me start with the situation in Israel concerning the virus and the economic situation. And unfortunately, I have to say that so far we have failed, and we have failed twice. We have failed with the coronavirus. We succeeded very, very well in the beginning, but then everything practically went wrong with the coronavirus crisis. I'll be very specific in a moment. At the moment also, not only do we have a very serious economic crisis ahead, but also it is not going in the right direction. And I want to explain why at the moment we are in a very bad situation and why my perspectives for the future are basically optimistic. And it sounds like a contradiction, but you will understand in a moment how these two can come together. But let me start with the coronavirus. As I said in the beginning, we identified it very fast, we did the right thing, we had closures, we brought it down dramatically. And then under enormous pressure from the public, the government went too far, far too far, in opening the Israeli economy very, very fast in an uncontrolled manner. And we are now suffering not only from this bad decision, but also from a series of bad decisions along the way, and some difficulties, serious difficulties, that can be explained only by understanding the Israeli society. If you remember, Jan, I insisted when I presented the 4 issues to start with the Israeli society because it explains everything. It explains the politics, it explains security, it explains the economy, it explains the virus, it explains everything in Israel. Don't look too much to the government, look at the Israeli society. And the reason we failed now, and the reason I think we will succeed later, both have to do with the Israeli society. Now, what is wrong with the Israeli treatment of the virus? A, the Israeli government is very ineffective. Most people living out of Israel are not fully aware of it. Every Israeli is. The government is not effective and sometimes even pushing in the wrong direction on many issues. And the fact that Israel is a success is not thanks to the government, but to a very large extent in spite of the government. Now, sometimes governments do the right thing. You may have heard this expression before, governments eventually do the right thing, not before they've exhausted all other options. And this is true in Israel in many, many fields, and it is true now. The Ministry of Health is a catastrophe. It was guided primarily for a long time by the ultra-Orthodox, and the only thing they want is the welfare of their group inside the Israeli public and to have their shenanigans inside the government. But even other ministries are not effective, not very effective in Israel. And this demonstrates the moment they have the authority, things don't work. But there is something even worse. In the Israeli society, you have two major problems that follow us on every issue, including this one. First of all, Israelis are not disciplined in any way. Every Israeli knows better than the people who give him instructions. And with the exception of security issues where people realize that the government is doing the right thing, and only if they come to the conclusion that the government is doing the right thing, and then they will be disciplined. In most fields in Israel, you have no discipline whatsoever. I don't like it in the narrow sense of the term. I like it very much in the broader sense of an Israeli society that is loose in terms of its discipline. I like it. I wouldn't like to live in a disciplined country, but it has its cost. And here we have a demonstration of the cost. Israelis will hear the instructions and then they will say, I know better. I don't like it. It's too hot. It's too humid. I think it's not a good idea. And then they won't follow instructions. But the second thing is more serious, and this is at the core of the immediate crisis. Now, speaking of the weeks, of the recent 2 or 3 weeks, and the weeks to come, this is the main issue. We have two societies, perhaps three. I will be very open about the discussion concerning the third, but I am very resolute concerning the two societies in Israel where we have major, massive problems, and I don't expect them to go away. The three societies, or the 2.5, are the ultra-Orthodox, the Arabs, and something that, for a better choice of words, I will call the party-goers. In these three cases, we have gregarious publics, namely people who live in public, who cannot maintain their social life unless they have major gatherings. And in these gatherings, the virus is spreading, and these societies don't care. They know that it kills them, but they cannot stop these gatherings on a massive scale, on a very, very large scale and continuous scale. And this is a major tragedy for everybody watching it from the outside, but an absolute necessity for the people who live this way. When it comes to the ultra-Orthodox community, I'm speaking about synagogues. This is not only true about the ultra-Orthodox, also about the Orthodox, but much worse when it comes to the ultra-Orthodox. You have huge gatherings with their rabbis, thousands of people crammed together, no masks, very little masks. For the television, they will have a place where they will take pictures of people with masks, but they cheat in whatever they touch. So you have thousands of people coming together without any kind of precaution, very close to each other. And there is very little you can do about it unless you are willing to apply very strong pressure from the police. And because they are strong politically, you cannot apply very strong pressure. Let me give you an example. These are not only synagogues, these are yeshivas. And this is this absolute absurd of going to the grave in the Ukraine for people who believe that the rabbi is the Messiah, or the people who believe that if they don't go there and dance and are thousands of people together very close to each other, then they cannot fulfill their religion. Has nothing whatsoever to do with religion. It has to do with a way of life. And now we are trying to prevent it, but the state cannot go very far because it is afraid they will lose them in the coalition. And they're saying very openly, no matter what you tell us, we will break any rule, any regulation, we will go there in our many, many thousands, and it will kill them, but they will still go there. They will infect everybody else, but they will still go there. And politically, it's very difficult to stop it because they have enormous political power. They have their people sitting on all the major junctions of Israel. You can't spend any kind of money until you satisfy them because they sit there. This is what they want when they're asking for political power. And their cities in Israel, their actions in Israel are a major source, one of the most important for infections in Israel. This is one society. The other society is the Arab society, particularly the Arab Muslim society. And again, it is something that they do because it is their way of life. You have weddings, you have funerals, and these people cannot have a normal life, what they perceive to consider a normal life for a long time, unless you have these gatherings again on a massive scale, not only in terms of the numbers of people in each meeting, but much more important, so many meetings, so many weddings, so many funerals that you have in private homes, even if they cannot get a hall to do it in, then they do it in their private homes, but again, with a very large number of people and very, very many such events. And there, again, the problem is to impose the will of the government, because the moment you do it against Arabs, then somebody starts shouting, this is racism. But you cannot respond to people based on what they do because of what they are, and the fact that it doesn't look good when you go against them, and they will be very violent in preventing it, and there is absolutely nothing they will not do in order to keep this way of life. For a while, they could be contained, but in the long run, it doesn't work. Now, let me be very specific. It is not all the ultra-Orthodox, it is not all the Arabs, but the groups inside these communities are large enough to create a major problem. You even have ultra-Orthodox that, as a result of the corona, when they were helped massively by the Israeli army, became more open to the general Israeli population. But you have a very, very large number of people who are radicals, and the leadership of the ultra-Orthodox Jews is not willing to work against the radicals, because once they are less than 100% radical, they are perceived by their own people as having capitulated to the wrong people. Now, the third element, I'm much more hesitant because I don't have any numbers. This is just common sense speaking, and I may be wrong. And these are the party goers. We have videos from very large parties where a very large number of people are together without any kind of masks or any kind of protection. And they believe that living in the party is part of their life. This is what they're about. It is their parties. This is a smaller number, a much smaller number. And again, I don't have any evidence. Maybe I'm wrong. But what all these three groups have together is that they're not part of the Israeli solidarity system. The ultra-Orthodox don't want to be a part of it. Again, not all of them, but enough of them in very, very large numbers that makes it a problem. The Muslim Arab population that behaves on socio-economic issues very different from the Christian Arab population, wants to be a separate people. They are the first to say, the Jews say it too, but the Arabs say it, and it's important that it comes from both sides, that we are not the same people. There is the Jewish people, there is the Arab people, we are citizens of the same country, subject to the same law, but in terms of the solidarity for the broader Israeli society, they don't feel the solidarity like regular non-ultra-Orthodox Jews feel. And also among the partygoers, you have this element, we live in a world of our own, we don't care because this is our life. So in two cases, the numbers are there, the evidence is there, it's very clear, you cannot disagree with it. Concerning the third group, I'm not sure, I'm presenting it as a possibility. The problem is that when you can combine the ineffectiveness of the government, the fact that we are in the midst of a political crisis that is not getting better, the fact that Israelis don't have any discipline, and these two, perhaps more groups inside the Israeli society that do not play by the rules and are willing to become sick on a much, much, much larger scale. This is a problem. For instance, we tried to have in Israel red cities, yellow cities, and green cities. Red, where the virus has spread in a very major way, yellow, where it is getting better, and green, where it is basically good. When you look at the red cities, there are ultra-Orthodox and Arabs, a few others, but the others come out of it usually. The ultra-Orthodox sometimes do, sometimes don't. The more radical the element of ultra-Orthodoxy, the more they're red, the more they completely disregard these instructions that are necessary for their own health and their own life. So this is the problem at the moment. We still have a very large number of people who are getting infected every day. We have about 1,600 people, 1,700, sometimes as much as 2,000 that are contracting the disease every day in a population that is relatively small, 9-point-something million people. But this is something that we have at the moment. Now, if you think that the corona crisis is a problem, look at the economy. And this is much, much worse and much, much more serious. And let me devote most of the time for the discussion of this element. The problem is that we are expecting, for the first time since the establishment of the State of Israel, a drop in the public, in the income per capita. In other words, if you look at Israeli growth, economic growth, it has never been negative. If you take the major economic crisis that we had here, in 1965-66, we had a major recession. Growth became relatively small. We needed at the time at least 10% per year. This was when we were very, very poor and coming up. And it was a major problem when we had a low growth, but there was a growth. We had a crisis after the Yom Kippur War. We have the crisis after the Second Intifada. In all these crises, economic growth was positive. Smaller, much smaller, but positive. Now we are expecting something like 6% minus, in other words, negative growth for the first time. Now, in recent weeks, they say it may not be so big. Let us see. I would like to see a longer period of time when we are checking it. But we are speaking about something like 6.3% negative growth. And here is something positive about Israel that has a negative impact. We have a lot of children. Our population is growing, unlike the European population. So the growth per capita is even worse. It is something like 8.2 negative per capita. And that's very, very bad news. Very bad news. Now, again, maybe things will not be as bad as they look now. I don't know. But even if it is only 6.5% negative per capita, it is very, very, very bad. And again, no precedent since the establishment of the State of Israel. Something that is even worse. We have a huge number of unemployed people. If you incorporate in it the people who were sent out to absence without leave, to absence without pay. In other words, at the moment they're not working, they may come back, but we don't see, in spite of opening the Israeli economy, we don't see them coming back. And if you have for a long period of time, and this is not something that will go away very fast, a high percentage of unemployment, there are different figures, but I've heard 21% as a relatively stable, a relatively credible number. And it's at the moment not going down, and it is affecting primarily young people. And we are afraid that something will happen that already did happen in Greece and in Spain. Namely, that young people will not have any experience in work, and there is a psychological factor that makes it difficult for them, and there is an economic factor that makes it more difficult for them to engage in work later in life. This is a very dangerous event in Israel, if it happens. Again, we must do whatever we can to prevent it from happening. Now, why is it particularly important in Israel? Because if you have a high rate of unemployment, primarily of young people, in a society that is very diverse, you will find very soon that unemployment focuses on certain parts of the population that are identifiable. And this brings social unrest. And if this is happening in Israel, then we are in very deep problem, because then it has a social effect, a political effect. And remember, Israel is a country that could go to war in Gaza, where the barbarians are shooting rockets into Israel because they want more money from Qatar, in Lebanon, where they are in big trouble inside Lebanon, and one of the ways of getting out of it may be a war with Israel. We are at war with Iran already, that is trying to dominate the Middle East. We discussed it last time. So imagine the combination of a high rate of employment, social unrest, and the possibility of war. Social unrest associated with certain groups inside Israel, even worse, and the combination can be very explosive. Now, after having depressed you completely, I hope, I mean, this is what I tried to do by simply giving you the data, let me look at the broader picture and present a perspective that is much more optimistic. First of all, we have spoken about the weaknesses of the Israeli society. We have not spoken about the economic effect of the strengths of the Israeli society. First of all, Israelis don't deal with the problem seriously until it is on the verge of a catastrophe. But once it is on the verge of a catastrophe, our response our ability to adjust ourselves is very, very good. Let me give you two interesting examples. A number of years ago, Israel had a water problem on the level where people were expecting water not to come out of the faucets when you open them. It was very, very serious. And then when the problem became almost catastrophic, Israelis found technological, organizational, and financial ways. And today Israel is, if I'm not mistaken, the most advanced country in the world when it comes to desalinization and using water more than once, sometimes even more than twice. First of all, concerning desalinization, Israel is a superpower today. We are in a position now where we are considering the possibility of desalinizing water from the Mediterranean and bringing this water into the Sea of Galilee. I mean, not even for drinking water. At the moment, we don't need it because we had a lot of rain and the Sea of Galilee is again full, but we have considered it. We may give Jordan, we are already giving Jordan much more water than the Jordanians deserve. I think it's a good idea to do it. And part of it is desalinized water. So we are in a very good situation when it comes to using water again. We are number one in the world. And number two is 30% less effective than Israel. So the gap is enormous. A major problem, near catastrophe, solved very well. Now, there you only needed technology, financing, and planning, but it worked. Let me give you another interesting example. In 1985, not so many years ago, Israel had an inflation that you couldn't even calculate. The joke at the time was that it is cheaper to take a taxi than to take a bus because the taxi you pay at the end of the ride. By the time you reach your destination, the money lost so much of its value that it was easier to pay for a taxi than for a bus, okay? We were speaking about 100% of inflation. I remember being asked in Congress, how much is the Israeli national debt? I gave them the number. They asked me, how much is it in shekels? And I said, all of them. I mean, it was even impossible to calculate. And then one day in 1985, we turned around. And since then, the Israeli economy is in very good shape. Actually, the shekel is far too strong. I would have liked a shekel that is 4 shekels, not 4 shekels for the for the euro, but 5 shekels for the euro, even 5 shekels to the dollar. It would have been better for the Israeli export. But the Israeli money, the Israeli currency is so strong that it is too strong for the good of the Israeli society. The question is, can you go back to the very good situation that we were in on the eve of the corona crisis? One of the reasons that Israel is not falling apart is that our debt ratio from the GDP was very good before the corona crisis. Our unemployment was very, very low. Our foreign currency reserves were very, very high. We were buying dollars in a desperate attempt to bring down the shekel and to raise the dollar. And therefore, we bought dollars as much as we possibly could. And our reserves were in excellent position. And also, we have a very solid financial system. We had a crisis in the banks. We were in very bad shape. We solved the crisis. We are in very good shape today. And we had all these things going for us. So we went into this crisis in good shape. And if you look at the experience of Israel, if you look at the history of Israel, you will see that even when we were in very difficult situations, we came out of it and succeeded much better than we were before. Having entered the crisis with a good situation, coming out of it is also promising. But there is also something else where Israeli innovation comes into, and where this may sound a bit strange to you, but every time Israel has a problem, it is making money out of it. I hope the anti-Semites will not misuse what I'm about to say now, but let me give you a very interesting trend. In the Yom Kippur War, Israel was in a terrible risk because of massive attacks on Israel on the scale that you can only compare to the Second World War. And when you speak about a very small country being presented with a threat of thousands of tanks attacking Israel, you can imagine that this was an enormous threat to Israel. So we realized we must reinvent ourselves on the conventional level. We made major mistakes in 73. Again, the Israeli system. First reach a catastrophe, then find a very good response to it. We developed our arms industry to the point where, if I'm not mistaken, Israel is today number 5 weapons exporter in the world. Some people don't like it. They believe that weapons export is not a good thing, but you need to do it, and everybody does it for the simple reason that you cannot afford, particularly when you're such a small country as Israel, you cannot develop your own weapons if you cannot sell them, perhaps a less advanced version, to somebody else. So we sell military equipment on a major scale. I think that after the United States, Russia, China, and France, we're number 5. Maybe I'm mistaken, and there is another 1 or 2 there, but I think this is the category we are in. So it started with a terrible problem and ended up with us selling the product of our innovation on something we were challenged. Let me give you a second example. Israel was attacked by terrorists more than any other country that you can possibly imagine in the democratic world. And they attacked Israel on such a massive scale because we were a democratic state. In other words, because Israel is sensitive to terrorism, because Israelis care for the lives of people. So I don't think any other country was attacked by so many elements on the terrorism scale, and Arabs tried to kill Jews every day. They succeeded yesterday in killing a civilian in Petah Tikva, in Israel. If Israel would not have prevented it, we would have had hundreds of cases of terrorism every day killing Israelis. The only reason they cannot do it is because we intercept it and we prevent it by force. Otherwise, we would have had terrorism on a scale that no society can live with. This is what happened to us with the Second Intifada until we found a way to deal with it. And since we are attacked so much, we developed an expertise in terrorism. And today, Israelis are selling this expertise all over the world. And you will hardly find a major international event where the Israelis are not leading the security measures. So they started by trying to kill us, and we ended making money out of it. In other words, what we have learned, we teach other democratic open societies so that they will not be subject to terrorism. Let me give you a third example, perhaps 2 are not enough. Israel is the most attacked country in the world when it comes to cyber terrorism. Every day we have, I think, I'm not sure about the numbers, but in the vicinity of 7,000 serious attacks. I'm not speaking about the easy attacks that you automatically foil because you have systems that will prevent it from happening. Serious attacks, if I'm not mistaken, 7,000 attacks a day. This is the order of magnitude, anyhow. Okay. Israel is today a cybersecurity superpower. I mean, there is Israel and the United States, and then the rest of the world. We are a superpower in cybersecurity. And again, it is a large portion of our export. I think that if you speak about only security export in Israel, it is $8 billion a year, which is very high for a small country. And the best way to name it, I think, is how do you make sweet lemonade out of bitter lemons? In other words, what you get is bad: war, terrorism, cyber attacks. What you do is you develop the most advanced technologies and you sell it all over the world. Israel is already a power when it comes to medical issues. And it will become more of a power because A, we need it, B, we can sell it. And it is all possible because the Israeli society is so creative. So I don't have any doubt that in time, in the beginning, I thought it may take 2 years. I'm now less optimistic. Maybe it will take 3 or 4 years. In 3 or 4 years, certainly in 5 years, you will see Israel in the forefront of offering solutions of automation that we need now much more, of pharma, of innovations concerning management of health, not just the elements that you give the patients, but managing the whole system. And the good news is that if you look at what Israel has done in the past, under much more difficult circumstances, you can expect Israel to respond to the challenge now also on a very good level. So this is the bad news and the good news about the corona and the economy. Let me say one thing more about the economy, but coming from a completely different angle, from the angle of Europe. Europe is Israel's largest trading partner, and we depend a lot on cooperation with the Europeans. On the one hand, this is not a one-sided deal, because the Europeans benefit from the Israeli innovation as much as we benefit from our cooperation. So this is not something that the Europeans do because they like us. They do it because we are one of the best people, best places in the world to develop what Europe needs. So our trade with Europe is based, by the way, not only on technology, also on agricultural products, because we are close, because we have a very developed agriculture, because we have agricultural technologies that are helping throughout the world, including in Europe. And the Europeans do it for economic reasons. But you have a very strong frustration in Europe that Israelis are not taking the Europeans seriously when it comes to the international scene, and particularly telling us what to do with vis-a-vis the Arabs and particularly the Palestinians. And the Europeans wish to punish us. And they need it for reasons that are not economic. They have to do with what the Europeans think of themselves. They think that they will bring peace and democracy to the Middle East. They have this la-la land perception that so far failed completely, with practically no impact of Europe in the Middle East, particularly when it comes to the issues that Israel is involved in. But the Europeans are obsessed with it. Let me give you an interesting example to demonstrate it. everybody now with half a brain knows that the Palestinian issue in the Middle East is negligible in its importance, not just marginal, negligible. If tomorrow there is peace between Israel and the Palestinians or war between Israel and the Palestinians, the impact on the Middle East is exactly zero. But the Europeans feel that it's a very important issue for them, and they are more or less obsessed with it, and they have taken the relationship between Europe and Israel hostage to the Palestinian issue. If you want to cooperate with us economically, if you want to cooperate with us scientifically, do what we are telling you to do vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Now, the Israelis can be very polite, but they can't take the Europeans seriously, because if, God forbid, Israel listens to the Europeans very much, I don't mean on tactical issues here and there, but in terms of the basic approach, Israel cannot survive. Israel needs to use force on a level that Europe is not willing to digest. And if Israel doesn't do it, the overwhelming majority of Israelis know that Israel will not survive in this harsh region. But it affects the economy. The Europeans are saying openly that they're not willing to upgrade their relations with Israel until we do what they say concerning the Palestinians. And they want to punish us economically because they have no other leverage on us. And from an Israeli point of view, even if Europe punishes us, we have only a very limited leeway that we can adjust ourselves to please the Europeans, because otherwise the results will be catastrophic. And the overwhelming majority, every government in Israel, Europeans pretend that it has to do with the right wing or with Netanyahu, but every government in Israel cannot accept what the Europeans want. Now, at the moment, we are in a good situation in Europe because we did not apply Israeli sovereignty to parts of the West Bank, and this would have produced responses from Europe that are really disproportionate. But for a good reason, because what we got from the United Arab Emirates is 100 times more important. And one of the things we got from the United Arab Emirates is that the Palestinians are much less important because they cannot stop it, so we can disregard them, as we must if we want to do something that helps the security and the welfare of Israel. So at the moment, there is no problem. But if the barbarians in Gaza will produce an inevitable clash, and people in Gaza will die because these barbarians put their missiles inside civilian population, and as much as Israel tries, you cannot prevent civilians from getting killed. And even if you go beyond the lies of the Palestinians, some of the people are really civilians. Or if we have to march into Lebanon, which will be the case if the missiles of Hezbollah will make life in Tel Aviv impossible. Israel will, on a major scale, go into Lebanon. And then the Europeans will go berserk because they don't care if there is another way to deal with the threat to Israel's existence. What they care about, they want it to look good, and it will not look good. War doesn't look good. The kind of war that the Arabs impose on us doesn't look good. The Arabs try to make the kind of war that will create as many civilian casualties on their side because they know that this will mobilize Europe against Israel. So if this happens, we will have a problem with Europe, and this problem with Europe will also affect the Israeli economy. What can Israel do about it? Very little. You can be more polite with the Europeans, you can be nicer, you can avoid from doing this or that minor issue, but there is something very fundamental that makes it different, that makes it difficult. Now, perhaps to end on a more positive note, this is the problem with Europe when it speaks in one voice. So concerning the European Union, there is no way Israel can come with any kind of a deep, fundamental compromise with the European Union. This is lost. Individual countries are much better. When you speak about the bilateral relations, our relations with most European countries are good, and some are even very good, and some are fair. Countries that are consistently hostile are primarily Sweden and Ireland. You have countries that are persistently friendly or very friendly. Germany is one of the friendly countries to Israel. There are very friendly countries like the Czech Republic and so on. So in terms of the bilateral relations, the situation is much better. It is primarily the elites that have these positions vis-a-vis Israel, journalists, academics, artists, and so on. But unfortunately, since they control the media, they also create a very negative image of Israel in public opinion. And one other thing, Europe is not very effective. Namely, even if the Europeans want to apply sanctions, it is relatively easy to bypass the sanctions. It will still create harm, but not as much as the Europeans will want to harm Israel if Israel does things that they don't like, or when, let me be more specific, when Israel does things that they don't like. So basically, is it a problem? Yes. Is it an insurmountable problem? No. Let me end by saying the following. Recognition of the seriousness of the difficulty we're in today is important for fixing it. So I gave you a very unpleasant picture of today's problem, but recognizing the ability to deal with it is, in the final analysis, the most important. We have dealt with much more serious difficulties, and I think we will deal very effectively with this one. Ask me in 5 years, okay? If you want a perspective of this, you need to look at a few years. And after a few years, in my view, this will be seen as one of the many crises that Israel has survived and constantly became stronger. Let me stop here and open the floor for whatever you would like to bring up.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was, as always, a lot of very valuable information. And I share your optimism. Sometimes, as you have said, you need a catastrophe. So I think it was Lyndon B. Johnson that said the situation will worsen before it improves. But I think I'm quite optimistic that Israel will master this crisis as well. I have two questions. The one is rather specific. From what I know about the Israeli technical power, do you have any information on this, the development of vaccinations made by Israelis? And another thing, Ursula and I did an interview last week with the federal commissioner of the German government for Jewish life in Germany and the fight against anti-Semitism. And he reported of a case where one university student said the two biggest lies in human history were the Holocaust and the coronavirus. I had to think of this when you said that Israel might come out of the crisis stronger by inventing something that would help the rest of the world, but which is probably likely to trigger even more anti-Semitism.
Look, everything will trigger anti-Semitism. It doesn't really matter. I mean, look, they accused us at the same time of inventing capitalism and inventing communism. So it doesn't really matter who wins. We are to blame. It is, I think the best way to approach it is, and I'm sorry that I'm doing it to our viewers, but it is the same way that husbands must come to learn to live with the fact that they're always guilty, no matter what they do. This is the essence of marriage. It is a union of two people where the husband is guilty. Okay, so I don't, and I know that I'm touching on a traumatic spot in many people who listen to us, but I think that trying to do something that will avoid anti-Semitism is useless. I only wish that this person that said that Israel invented these two lies, or the Jews invented these two lies, will get a case of corona that will be mild, just, you know, as for the sake of fun, for enjoying it. I don't want him to die from it or to suffer too much, just to feel some discomfort and to make him think about it. You can't even take it seriously. No, you should take it seriously because it's there, okay? So you should take it seriously because it has murderous effects. But you can't take the arguments seriously. People need to hate Jews. Now, what's the excuse is really much less important. They want to hate Jews. It's okay. We've survived it for a long time. I don't expect it to change very much. And the moment I have any illusions, I simply go to Europe and my illusions are immediately cleared.
Yeah, I think so. I think from what you said in your first lecture, there seems to be that some groups, and you mentioned among them the ultra-Orthodox, they always profit by things that other Israelis also do, which would be like countering the pandemic and so on. Is communication that down that, I mean, it's probably hard for us as Europeans because we do not live with them on this scale, but wearing a mask when you're in a bus or when you're in a crowd is reasonable, and it is not something that is so hard to do. Why is it so hard to communicate this?
The problem is not communicating. Look, let me respond first to what you said before about the ultra-Orthodox. They live because we are not like them. If we would like them, if we would be like them, they would die because the Arabs would slaughter them and they would die of starvation, okay? And they would die because there would be no medical treatment, okay? You cannot dissect their bodies because it is some superstition about it, but they want the benefit of the dissection of the bodies of others, okay? They, their men go to work much less than others, but they benefit from the strong economy. They can get their money from us in the billions of shekels, even in the billions of dollars, because we are not like them, because we work, because we are educated, because we are innovative, and so on. They can live because we go to the army to defend them. Otherwise, they would be slaughtered. Okay, so I can't be very, you know, nice about saying something that is not true. And whatever the problem of Israel is, you will find that the ultra-Orthodox are part of it. If you have economic problems, it has to do with the fact that they don't work. If you have health problems now, it is because some of them are willing not only to get sick, but to spread the disease, okay? And they spread it to their own children. And the question is for what? For dancing at a grave in the Ukraine, where they have this belief that the rabbi is the Messiah or something. I mean, this is
Rabbi
something.
Nachman, I think.
This is something that is completely bogus. Okay.
Yeah. We'll have some more, but maybe I'll give the floor to Ursula now to ask if we have any questions, or maybe she's got one herself.
Well, actually, we have a few questions and a comment. Actually, one of our viewers summarizes your elaborations like this, which is quite interesting. He says, Palestinians, excuse me, Palestinians are working on the past, Israelis are working on the future, and Europeans are working on dreams. As I said,
On what? On what, the Europeans?
Europeans are working on dreams.
Ah,
Would you like to comment?
I can say Israelis are constructive, but let me be very specific here. There are constructive Palestinians, only they don't lead the Palestinian community. I mean, it's not as if you're born a Palestinian, or you must be this or that, or you're born an Israeli, you must be this and that. I just gave you an example of Israelis who are not innovative. The ultra-Orthodox, they're Israelis, they're Israeli citizens. They're not innovative, okay? And by the way, there are innovative ultra-Orthodox. There are ultra-Orthodox who serve in the army. There are ultra-Orthodox who work, okay? So it's not if you're born an ultra-Orthodox or an Arab or an Israeli, you must be this and this or that. The question is, who can lead these communities, how they behave as a collective, what is more common among them? Not working is more common among ultra-Orthodox than among other Israelis. Being constructive is something that the Palestinians as a community, as a people, have not been able to do in 100 years since they came into existence. And when they had a constructive leader, Salam Fayyad, the person who could have, who is a nation builder, he never got more than 2% of public support, okay? There are some Europeans who are the finest people I can imagine on every level that I can think of. But Europeans, elite as a collective, have really dreams or illusions or fantasies about the world that have proven again and again to be totally unrealistic. Now, it doesn't mean that every European intellectual is like that. I know hundreds of them who are not. It doesn't mean that every European must be an anti-Semite. Most of them are not, okay? The only question is, what is more prevalent in one society than in other societies? What kind of people can become leaders of one society and cannot become leaders of other societies?
Okay, one of our viewers has the following question. Do you have any literature recommendations to learn about the history of modern Israel?
Unfortunately, I know of very little that was written about Israel that is general. Now, maybe good books are there, but I'm not exposed to them because I read the much more specific issues because this is professionally what I do. I can't think of, at the moment, of a good book on the subject that is general enough. Again, because my interest is in very specific issues that I study in very great detail, and most people will not enjoy reading the books that I'm reading because it will bore them. It is too detailed, too specific. I can only tell you that I was looking for a book about Israel's national objectives, and to my amazement, I couldn't find anything that looks at it in a broad enough perspective. I found a lot of people who wrote about security and then added elements of economy, and they added elements of foreign policy and said a few things about society, but I haven't found anything that speaks in a perspective of more than 100 years of the objectives of the Zionist movement and the state of Israel, checking back and looking what have we achieved and what have we failed. And because I couldn't find it, I wrote a book about it. And I finished writing it in Hebrew, and it is now in the process of becoming a book. And then it will be translated into English, and then I will be delighted to recommend it to anybody who's interested in looking at what the objectives were, where have we succeeded, where have we failed, why have we failed, what can we learn from our failures, This is exactly what I did in the books that I'm writing now.
Mhm. Another question is that does not just deal with the economy or with the corona crisis is like this. How do you see the future in the Middle East? Will perhaps new states be established in the coming future? And how would their relationship be with Israel?
Look, the only thing that can change in terms of other states being established that we don't see now would be if one day a Kurdish state will be established, because we have a Kurdish people and they're scattered in Iran and Iraq and Turkey and Syria. And this is a people, a cohesive people. There are a lot of differences, but you can speak about a Kurdish people and a people that doesn't have a state on a large scale. But unfortunately, I cannot see much hope in the Middle East when it comes to the Arab states, because they were not engaged for more than 100 years in nation building. Unfortunately, their future looks dim because their present looks dim. They cannot feed themselves. They are in a situation where people suffer, where they could have lived in Elysium. I mean, countries like Libya, like Iraq, are so rich that they could have not only helped themselves, but everybody else in the region. But look what is happening there. The problem is Arab political culture, the lack of pluralism, the inability to introduce pluralism on a massive scale. There are places in the Arab world that have succeeded, but unfortunately they're on the fringes of the Arab world. They're not the mainstream in the Arab world. You don't even have a serious and steady progress in terms of women's rights. You cannot have a society where you give up 50% of the human potential. And when it comes to more pluralism, more science, look, once empires were built where you had fertile ground and water. This is how Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley became ancient empires. Later, it was iron and coal and industry. Today, everything is happening up here, okay? If you want to be successful, you need to reconsider things. How can you reconsider when it's illegitimate to bring up a new idea, to bring up different concepts, to tell the regime that it is wrong about something? It is not an accident that countries that don't have any kind of innovation also don't have any kind of democracy, any kind of pluralism in their society. So these things are linked, and the Arab world is in deep trouble. I used to have a hope for 3 countries in the Middle East, namely the non-Arab countries, Israel, Iran, and Turkey. I now have hopes for Israel and Iran, much less for Turkey, because in Iran you have a very healthy society and a very sick regime. In Turkey, you have a sick regime supported by the majority of Turks. So even if we would have had democratic elections in Turkey, Erdogan probably would have been elected. And Erdogan, I think, is a catastrophe for the future of Turkey. The Muslim Brothers are a catastrophe for anybody. So I'm not very hopeful about Turkey. I'm not very hopeful, and I'm saying it with great sadness as an Israeli. I'm not very hopeful about Egypt. You have 100 million people there. And short of a cultural revolution that is not coming, I don't see how these 100 million people can feed themselves, let alone find themselves a way into the 21st century. Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic there. I have great hopes for Israel and Iran. Israel already is in a good situation. Iran, if it gets rid of the barbaric regime, will be in a good situation. I don't see much of a problem in Israel or Iran. But the rest of the Arab world, I'm not very optimistic.
Well, so far for this question. Here we have another question on economics. How do you evaluate the growing gap between poor and rich in Israel, given the current crisis?
I don't have a problem, but that's a question of Weltanschauung. I don't have a problem with a gap between poor and rich. Let the gap be huge, I don't care. I want the poor that are working hard, that are doing what they can, I want them to have the minimum that they need on 4 different issues: food, housing, education, health. Okay? If they can have a minimum, they shouldn't have as much as the rich. I don't believe in equality. If you work hard, I want equality of opportunities. Yes. But I have no problem with people being rich and people being poor, and rich people with their taxes helping poor people who cannot make it even if they work hard. Let me just say that the numbers about poverty in Israel are manipulated, they are lies by people who have a Weltanschauung that believes that there should be equality. And therefore, they're measuring inequality and calling it poverty because they want to manipulate our feelings, because they know that most Israelis don't care if the rich get richer as long as the poor also improve their situation. So they're trying to give us guilt, and it's not working. So when they tell us, one of the organizations here said that there are 1 million people who are hungry in Israel. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. They're playing with numbers. They lost the confidence of most Israelis, and Israelis don't trust them. For instance, the 2 poorest communities in Israel are ultra-Orthodox and Arabs, because in the ultra-Orthodox community, half of the men don't work. And in the Arab community, Arab Muslim community, women work much less than in other communities. But this is not something because somebody works against the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, because the ultra-Orthodox get more money than any other community in Israel, and they're still poor because they don't work, because they don't educate their children, because their children the rabbis don't want the children to be employable because they want them to depend on the rabbis. Arabs don't want their women, Muslim Arabs, don't want their women to meet other men, so they're very careful. But if you compare Muslim Arabs to Christian Arabs, you will see a huge difference. So it has nothing to do with them being Arabs. So you have Arabs who are rich or well-to-do because they're Christian and have a different attitude to education. And you have Jews who are poor because they're ultra-Orthodox and don't get a good education and don't work. Now, again, there are exceptions in both communities. I'm speaking about the majority. I'm speaking about the mainstream of these societies. Now, the people who manipulate the numbers, for instance, say, let us tell who's poor by asking him how much he makes. And if you know that he makes a lot of money in the black market and he's not reporting it and not paying taxes and he's cheating you, then you will not trust him when he tells you how much he makes. But they don't ask it. They don't find out. They don't want to find out. They're afraid to find out. When it comes to the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, a large majority of people have their own apartments. This means 1/3 of their expenses are spared because they have their own apartments. And this must be taken into account when you consider poverty. But politically, it is impossible to give a standard that is reliable because the ultra-Orthodox will prevent it because they sit in the government and they don't let the government tell the truth about the situation, because otherwise they will not be considered poor and they will not be eligible to get money that they don't deserve.
Okay, so far we haven't any further questions, but if you allow me, maybe one small question dealing with the elaborations, your elaborations on the economy in crisis, as you said. You also mentioned that Israel sees for the first time a sharp drop in the income per capita. So I wonder, which sector do you see suffers the most by this current crisis?
I was speaking where I have the numbers is the negative growth, and growth per capita is even more negative than the growth of the GDP. And what we have is young people, people with less skills, and certainly, but this is global, certain industries. The tourism industry, the travel industry, there we have, I think, and the entertainment industry and the cultural industry. I mean, wherever you cannot work without bringing a lot of people together. But again, this will change, and my fear is that weak economically, people who are economically weak will find it more difficult to find work. You see, when you have 4% unemployment in a country, as we had, I think 4 or 4.5% that we had before the Corona crisis, you can tell everybody, look, if you want to work, you can get work, okay? Maybe you won't like your work, but you can get work. But when you have a high rate of unemployment, then people who are much less qualified, who can be much less flexible about the kind of things that they can do, they will be the one hurt the most, okay? And this is a social problem. Now, if this becomes overlapping with Oriental Jews, it is even more dangerous, okay? So you need to see not only what the economic impact is, but also what the social impact is.
Okay. So thank you so much for now. I don't have any further questions that I could present to you. So maybe Jan has another question for you.
Now, something that you said, Dan, about poverty reminded me of the way this is calculated here. I think I would have to look it up. I think you count as poor if you earn less than half of the average wage earner in Germany.
Not the average, the median.
Yeah, median, right. And ironically, if everyone earns, like, let's say 1,000 euro more per month, you would have significantly more money than you would have the month before, but you would still be just as poor as you were before. Now, this is just what came to my mind.
But you see, this is not poverty. This is income inequality.
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
But over here, it counts as poverty. It's called the, as you speak German, Armutsbericht, I think. This is coming out once per year.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Look, the Europeans do it like the Israelis, but in Israel, they also cheat. You see, the head of the organization that measures it, it is called the National, not National Security, but national security. It's not a good translation, but anyway, it is It is the official organization that determines it. And the leader of it, after she retired, admitted that her numbers are skewed by 40%. Okay? I would be concerned if it were 5%, but she says 40%. Okay? And you have reports of people who are experts on the subject. The head of the Israeli Bureau of Statistics, for instance, said that the only way you will have less poor people in Israel is if you will have a massive wave of well-earning Israelis leaving Israel. Okay? And the whole thing is manipulated because of Weltanschauung. Now, I don't mind discussing things with people with a different Weltanschauung and saying, I don't want it, you want it, fine. Okay, let's ask the people if they want it or not. Do you want equality? I don't want equality. Okay? I don't want it. I'm not Swedish. I don't want high taxes. I want taxes that will make it possible for the government to give the poor the minimum, but not that I will work so that somebody else cannot work, and if he doesn't work, he gets allowances from the government in spite of the fact that he can work, okay? And in Israel, the problem is also, are they part of my solidarity? A person who says, I don't want to work because I want to sit in the yeshiva and learn, is not part of my solidarity. I don't want to feed him. He deserves to be poor. And I want him to be in a position where he either goes to work or is hungry. It's fine with me. I don't have a problem with it. Now, a person who cannot work because he's an invalid, a person who cannot work because of any other reason, and he convinces me that he cannot work, I want to help him. A person who works and does not earn enough for the basics, I want to give him negative income tax. That's okay, because I will pay income tax and he will get negative income tax. In other words, he will get what I am paying. I'm for it, okay? Provided he works, provided he does the maximum he can. I'm willing to help him only if he does the maximum he can. If he doesn't, I don't care if he suffers.
One more question I have regarding the government's response to the pandemic. In Germany, we have a lot of mitigating measures. I think the translation would be short-term allowance. It's called in German Kurzarbeitergeld, meaning that to prevent enterprises from firing people, the state pays certain subsidies. Do you have any parallel thing in Israel?
Unfortunately not. I think the German system is much better than our system. I would ask myself only one question: how can I encourage people to work? For instance, if the proprietor can only give some of the people a partial job, let them work for a partial job, let the proprietor pay for them for the half they're doing, let the government pay for the other half. Okay? Yeah. From my taxes, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with it. That's what I want. People who work, who do the maximum they can, businessmen who hire people and give them work, even if they can only do half a job and they pay for half a job and the government pays for the other half. I think that's a much better system. I think the system in Germany is much better than the system in Israel. We have a lot to learn from you.
Thank you. That's it from my side. So Ursula, unless we do not have any further questions.
We have one last question, and then I think we should give it a final call. Here's one question for at last. Is there a danger of social unrest for economical or political reasons?
Yes, I just mentioned it, and let me repeat. If you have a high rate of unemployment, if the government continues to be ineffective as it is today, if the government cannot get the confidence of the people, if this unemployment is focused on certain ethnic groups or in certain age groups, there can be social unrest in Israel. At the moment, there is very little violence, there is very little social unrest. People hate the government. I think it's okay. I mean, it happens in a democracy. They demonstrate against the government. Okay. They say things they don't mean. Okay. I don't care. Social unrest is something completely different. People who don't see hope, people who are in a dead end. And they're saying, we don't accept the rules of the game anymore. Okay? That's a completely different situation. Is there a danger? Yes. Do I think we can avoid it? Yes.
Great. Okay, so, thank you, Dan. I think that's it for now. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry. No, Dan, thank you very, very much indeed for another very interesting lecture full of information and food for thought. We're looking forward to our next one next week. I'll switch to German now. Also, wir haben ja noch einen Vortrag mit Dan. Der findet wieder statt in genau einer Woche, am Donnerstag, dem 3. September um 18 Uhr deutscher Zeit wieder. Und der Titel ist Die Beziehung zwischen Israel und der jüdischen Diaspora, insbesondere in den USA. Wir freuen uns wieder auf Zuschauer, Fragen, Anregungen, alles möglich und alles gerne. Und nochmal, Dan, einen ganz herzlichen Dank. Toda.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Thank you.
So, then we have switched off.